This week on Perspective, Canada and Europe. Canada's changing role in Europe's challenging political landscape. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau began this week in Washington, the epicenter of global uncertainty and concern about a new world order. A seismic shift in what it means to conduct meaningful international diplomacy and negotiation. By most accounts, Trudeau's sunny ways went over well at the White House. Neither leader criticized the other, and Trump's threat to renegotiate the worst trade deal ever, as he called it, devolved to tweaking.
Prime Minister, I pledge to work with you in pursuit of our many shared interests. This includes a stronger trading relationship between the United States and Canada.
It was a meeting watched very closely in Europe. That was made clear later in the week as Trudeau celebrated the new Comprehensive Economic Trade Agreement, or CETA, between Canada and the 28 member nations of the European Union. The President of the European Parliament is Antonio Tajani.
The relations between Europe and Canada are very, very important for paving the way for a better relation between the European Union and the United States of America.
Trudeau, though, attached even greater significance to the trade deal with Europe. Addressing European parliamentarians, he seemed to suggest it could be a bulwark against Trumpian trade views and growing populist nationalism.
If we are successful, CETA will become the blueprint for all ambitious future trade deals. If we are not, this could well be one of the last.
Earlier this week, I spoke with two experts about the situation in Europe. Jeremy Kinsman is an experienced former diplomat. Among his many postings, he was ambassador to the EU in Brussels. And Eric Reguly is European correspondent for the Globe and Mail, based in Rome. I spoke with them both at Ryerson University in Toronto. How would you describe the political climate generally in Europe right now?
I'd say it's poisonous in the sense that I've been in Europe almost 10 years, based out of Rome, but traveling a lot. And I think the mood in Europe now is worse than it was at the height of the crisis, the European crisis in 2011 and 2012. And I don't see it getting any better, especially since we have 3 or 4 really big elections coming up in the next few months, with the populist parties on the rise in many of these countries, and the good chance that in Italy we're going to get a populist Eurosceptic government.
When you say poisonous, what's seeding that poison?
The refugee crisis, for one. Mm-hmm. You know, that's hurt Angela Merkel, the German chancellor, a lot. It's driven the rise of Marine Le Pen, of the Front National in France. Less so Italy. There is even the mainstream parties in Italy are, I wouldn't say they're becoming overtly racist, but certainly the refugee crisis is hitting Italy very, very hard. 180,000 refugees came in 2016. And the polls actually say that the Italians, the level of xenophobia in Italy is the highest in Europe. I think it's something like 70% of Italians will admit to being afraid of foreigners and don't want them around.
It's an interesting shift. I mean, it's not just, the Trump administration in the US where we see this rise of sort of nationalist populist sentiment. Obviously, Brexit's part of it. But Jeremy, based on your experience as you look at history, is there a different quality to that sort of nationalist populist sentiment in Europe because of their history, do you think?
I think that their history to some extent moderates it, because they do remember the notion that they're dropping back to the 30s to that kind of populist nationalism. When Steve Bannon identifies the Trump administration as being a populist nationalist regime, Europeans are really staggered. You know? And I agree on that refugees, which they call immigration, which isn't like our immigration, they're people they didn't ask for, have been a real challenge to identity, partly because they didn't ask for these people and they're not prepared. But it's been going on for 20, 25 years. I mean, the disaster situation in the Middle East spewed out, a whole new wave of 1 million and more. But they'd been pouring in when I lived in Italy 20 years ago. you know, they were pouring in from Africa. And so the issue isn't sudden. And the nativist, populist, right-wing parties have been going at Brussels for 20 years. They blame Brussels for this, which is actually kind of unfair because Brussels has been rather inert on this issue. I'm not so pessimistic. I think that after Brexit, the polls showed that public opinion in Europe in favor of the European Union approval went up, even in Italy. It doesn't mean that the populist parties are going down, because in Italy and elsewhere, there are other reasons why they're supported. They're against the political establishments in their countries.
You're shaking your head here, Eric.
No, I've been doing some research in this, writing about it. The support for the EU and the euro is plummeting in Italy. The support for the euro, I'm going to get these numbers a bit wrong, but about 70% of the people in Eurozone countries support the euro. In Italy, it's down to 50%. Roughly, I think now it's switched on, I think more Italians, or as many or slightly more Italians, think that Italy will be better outside the euro than inside. So don't forget, this is a big economy. Italy is a big country. It's a founding member of the EU, original member of the Eurozone, one of the original 6. It was, the whole idea in Italy was, let's become a member of the EU and the Eurozone because we don't trust our own government. We're going to outsource it all to Brussels. And that's changing a lot. And I think if the Eurozone goes down, it's going to be because of Italy.
So this past week, the Prime Minister was in Europe celebrating this new trade agreement with Europe. Do you look at that then as kind of a last gasp if the situation is, if people are so negative about staying within the European
Well, they're not
Union?
negative throughout the EU or the Eurozone, but there are some key countries that are, one, Italy I would consider negative, and other countries the support is dropping. I mean, I don't see, the narrative is changing in Europe. I mean, the narrative in Europe was that the EU could solve our problems, whatever they were. Now what I'm seeing is that the EU is the source of our problems, especially the euro, and that manifests itself in high unemployment rates, viciously high unemployment rates in the Mediterranean. I think that is the central problem, is the euro, and maybe by extension the EU is being blamed for the chronically high unemployment rates, which are unsustainable.
So put Brexit into the picture now, and if those other European countries are looking at the United Kingdom to see how that works, I mean, is that sort of a significant point in terms of whether or not the European Union hangs together?
I think, look, you have to differentiate between the people who are the prime ministers of these countries in Europe and the so-called people. I mean, more of the people still support the governments that are in power. So the right-wing nativist parties may be gaining, but I think some of them, like Marine Le Pen, have hit their ceiling. But that being said, Brexit offended Europeans. It offended a lot more Europeans than it encouraged other Europeans to try to do the same stuff. And Theresa May going to Washington and basically prostrating herself in front of Trump in favor of the mythical special relationship really got the Europeans goat, because this was no longer an economic disagreement with European partners. This was an existential statement of values. We don't share the same values that you do. So I don't see the European governments at all dropping their tools. And the Canadian deal is more than just a deal with another country. We're the other North America, okay? It's a terrific brand to have, particularly when the United States is doing bad things like invading Iraq. We become quite popular. But it's because we share something, and that's liberal internationalism. We may be the last ones on the planet who do, but we're not giving up. And you know, in history circles around, and this thing isn't going away.
To say, is that what makes Trudeau popular in Europe, this idea of liberal internationalism, do you think, Eric?
I think he's popular because he's the un-Trump, that he's...
The un-Trump.
The un-Trump, that he's, well, good-looking guy, that helps. He's not building walls. He's through CETA, the trade deal, he's taking walls down between Canada and Europe. And he's showing Europe that Canada can assimilate and integrate immigrants really, really well. So that's a lesson that Europeans want to hear. And this is what we can show Europe, how it has succeeded in cities like Toronto, Montreal, very, very well. So I think that gives Europeans some hope that, you know, if the Canadians can figure this out on refugees and immigrants, maybe our crisis isn't a real full-blown crisis, and we should be able to figure this out some way.
He's also a very fresh new face who won election on an entirely positive campaign. And there's been so much negativity in campaigning everywhere else that hearing a voice that perhaps to some is naive, but that channels hope and aspiration and belief, it's terrific to hear.
So that's why Angela Merkel wants to stand beside him.
They want a piece of it.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
Yeah, absolutely.
Sure.
Yeah. What should we be watching for? What do you think are the sort of critical points now? I know there are several elections this year in Europe, but what will you be watching for as signs of either positive or negative?
Well, I think you're going to, first of all, in the order they come, there's Holland, but Holland's going to be unresolved. It's going to be another coalition government, and the right-wing nativist group, Wilders, is going to probably lead the pack, but he's not going to be in government. So the big one coming up is France. Mm-hmm. And we'll see. I mean, this has been you couldn't have invented this story of the principal candidate from the right and getting wound up in this stuff about paying his wife hundreds of thousands of euros for a job she wasn't doing. And then suddenly this guy, 39-year-old Emmanuel Macron, who's kind of a Trudeau, suddenly emerges. When it comes to the runoff, Macron, I think, will certainly beat Marine Le Pen. It's all a question of turnout, but the French vote about 80% in their presidential elections in the second round. So I think we'll get through France. On Germany, it's suddenly become interesting because the socialists who were, declared dead in a sort of a collective autopsy suddenly have been revived by a new leader whom we knew in Brussels very well, Martin Schulz, who's kind of a good, recognizable German. But I think Angela Merkel is still popular enough to pull it off. There's the alternative right that they're making a push, but they're mostly in the East, and I don't think they're going to do it. I defer to Eric on Italy, but I would say that Beppe Grillo and his party is picking up largely frustration on the part of Italians, especially young Italians, with Italy rather than with the European Union, though I take the point about the euro. But you can get out of the euro and stay in the Union, theoretically.
Theoretically,
that's right. So what are you watching for? What do you think are the critical points here?
I actually don't think the French and German elections are critical. I do not see a scenario where Marine Le Pen wins. I mean, I agree with you. I do not see a scenario where Angela Merkel loses. I do see a scenario where the five-star movement, it's called Cinque Stelle, wins. They're marginally ahead in the polls. The Democratic Party is in array. That's the center-left party. We have a technocrat government right now. Matteo Renzi resigned in December, right in front of me, as a matter of fact. I was in the same room. And the five-star movement is being supported. Yes, it's a protest movement, party, but also it's being supported by the young and jobless, of which there are millions and millions in Italy. And they're mostly in the South, but the South can swing this election. I believe they will win this election, and they've not threatened, they have promised to hold a referendum on the euro. Now you can debate whether this will be constitutionally legal. It may or may not be, but that's a very aggressive move. And even if it's a yes, a no vote to the euro, and it's declared, an invalid vote, it's still going to send a very powerful message to Brussels and the rest of Europe.
Thank you both very much.
Thanks.
Thank you.
In 2014, Canadian exports to the EU were $39.5 billion. Imports from the EU were $53 billion. The Comprehensive Economic and Trade Agreement is expected to increase Canada-EU trade by 20% and boost Canada's income by $12 billion. That increased income is the equivalent of creating 80,000 new jobs in Canada.
Trudeau ended his European trip in Germany, which boasts the largest economy in the EU and arguably its most influential leader, Chancellor Angela Merkel. We asked Canadian documentary filmmaker Jonathan Durand to speak to some Berliners about their views of the European Union and of Canada.
I think the European Union is important because Europe consists of so many small countries, so I think it's hard to compete with big powers like the US. So I think in order to have a balance of power, I think the EU is an important instrument.
Nowadays it seems that little countries like Germany, they can't really do anything just alone, and they need a strong union. So this, I think, is the main reason for me why the EU is important.
The idea behind Europe is a great one, but it's hard to get it work. Yeah, it's going to the extreme right and to the extreme left side. The middle thing is breaking.
I think the EU is important because of the connectivity of people and the easygoing over borders.
I think Canada's role is more important on the international, in the international stage. I want to say, kind of, and especially as a neighbor of the US. I don't know what their function could be, but yeah, I think it's especially nowadays more important than it was before.
What we Germans hear about Canada in the last 2 years is only positive. So we are kind of big fans of the government of the Canadians, and we all wish that for a lot of other countries. So we are maybe even a little bit Neidish. We even kind of want this a bit more for ourselves here.
One of the other key issues for Canada in Europe is NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, a military alliance based on cooperation on defense and security among its 28 member countries. Canada, for example, has committed to lead a NATO mission in Latvia, one of 4 being deployed in Eastern Europe in an attempt to deter Russian aggression. During the presidential campaign, Trump dismissed NATO as obsolete. His administration seems to have softened that stance somewhat, but this week, U.S. Defense Secretary James Mattis warned that unless others increase their defense spending, the U.S. would, quote, moderate its commitment. For more on NATO and Canada's role, I'm joined by Stephen Saideman. He holds the Paterson Chair in International Affairs at Carleton University's Norman Paterson School of International Affairs. You've said in the past that NATO hangs by a thread and that you're pessimistic. Why?
Because the heart of NATO is the commitment for each country to defend every other country. An attack upon one is equal to an attack upon all. But there's nothing automatic about that. It requires political decisions in the national capitals and at NATO headquarters. And that these days relies on a decision made by Donald Trump, who has been very, very skeptical about NATO. And so I could easily imagine a circumstance where there's some aggression in the East and the U.S. does not respond. And if the U.S. does not respond, that puts everybody else out on a limb.
Now, we've heard a slightly different tone, though, from the U.S. Secretary of Defense, James Mattis.
Yes, James Mattis was once SACEUR, which meant he led NATO. And as a former general, he is more multilateral than the average Trumpster. But the problem is that Mattis has proven thus far to be on the outside of this administration, that he was not involved in the decision to ban immigrants. And that had a lot of military equities, that the Defense Department has a lot of interest in that issue because of a variety of reasons, including the fact that the United States is currently involved in a war in Iraq. And the Iraqi response to that decision was potentially to get rid of all American contractors in Iraq, and those are fundamental to the war effort.
Let's talk a little bit about why you think NATO is a target in a sense. I mean, it's not just Donald Trump. There are others who look at institutions like NATO with some skepticism now and wonder if it's not sort of a body of another time. Does NATO run the risk of sort of the kind of institutional kind of disregard that many people hold now, that same sort of political wave that we've seen in Europe?
Well, I do think that the far right that is ascendant in both the United States and in Europe is skeptical of all institutions and is skeptical of multilateralism. So we see a lot of attacks on the EU, and we saw that with Brexit, and we've seen that with a lot of other efforts in Europe. And Trump is in some ways part of that larger movement of being skeptical about these institutions. And part of this is being funded by Russia, that Putin has been funding far-right movements that are opposed to NATO because one of his key policy objectives is to break NATO. And so that's where my concern is that he might launch some sort of aggression towards one of the Baltic countries, hoping that NATO fails to respond, which then leads to the end of NATO. Because if the promise to defend an ally isn't met, then what point is there to the alliance?
But at this point, NATO does have a plan to put troops in 4 of the Baltic states, and Canada's part of that.
That's right. That this was one of the big reliefs from last summer's Warsaw Summit, that there was a promise to move beyond just exercising. The previous effort was to avoid any kind of sense of permanence, but the fear I had and others had was that, on a given weekend, maybe there are no American or British or German or Canadian troops because of some rotation, some vacation, some whatever. But now there's going to be a permanent presence, but Canada is not getting there until May or June. The Americans moved quickly because Obama made the decision to move quickly before Trump became president. But one could imagine that in the normal sequence of events where the United States has to rotate the current troops out and put another set of troops in, you might see Trump delay that. And then there's an opportunity. And so I worry about that kind of opportunity.
The other issue for the Trump administration is the whole issue of other countries have to pay up. They have to pay their fair share. You've argued that, in fact, a percentage of GDP, the 2% requirement, isn't the right way to measure this. How do we measure our defense spending in terms of?
Well, I think the 2% promise, and the promise is not a ironclad promise.
Right.
The promise was an aspiration to reach 2% someday. It's in some ways unrealistic because it would require Canada and other countries to essentially double their defense budget, and that's not going to happen anytime soon. I think that NATO countries need to measure not just percentage of GDP, but what do you do? Because in the 2% measure, Greece looks great because Greece spends more than 2%. But Greece in any major NATO mission has not shown up in any kind of way. They had like 20 or 30 guys in Afghanistan based in some headquarters. That was doing a token effort and had no impact on the mission, whereas Canada had almost 3,000 troops, lost 158 soldiers and plus some civilians, made a major effort, made a major contribution. And so while all politicians have short memories, and obviously Trump's memory is far shorter than most, it's the doing that matters. And so there needs to be some discussion at NATO headquarters about how to talk about the doing and the spending, because both matter. Canada's continuing underspending is a problem because it makes Canada less ready. And that's the real important thing. It's not so much about reaching 2%, but the trade-offs we face means that our soldiers and our sailors and our pilots are not flying as much as they should be, not sailing as much as they should be. Their equipment might not be as good. The United States faces the same problem, that because of sequestration and budget problems, something like 2/3 of the Marines' planes can't fly. So that's a real issue about readiness. But what's happening right now, it's really a political thing where countries are complaining about burden sharing. And so the pushback Canada can have is we've borne more than our share of the burden. It was just measured in blood, not in dollars. And there should be pressure for countries to spend more money on defense because the need is arising with Russia's aggression. But we should not be exerting threats. The United States, at this moment in history, where you have a very skeptical president who has talked about the obsolescence of NATO, who is the most pro-Russia president in American history, issuing threats of making NATO seem like a protection racket. Well, if you don't spend the money, then maybe something bad happen to you, and that's really a problem.
So how do you counter that? I mean, apart from countries stepping up and being more ready, spending more money, how do you counter that? It's a political sentiment as much as anything.
Well, I think Canada's doing a good job of in this meeting that Saideman just had in Europe, pointing out the list of things that Canada's currently doing. Canada has got troops headed to Latvia. Canada is training the Ukrainians. Canada has a training mission in Iraq that Canada keeps showing up when necessary. And I think that Canada did a very good job in massaging Trump last week, in finessing the difficulties, in pandering to his ego, in elevating Ivanka. All these things were important for creating a mood, because for Trump, it's not about the realities of the world, but of really making him feel good about things. And I think we're doing a good job of that, and we need to keep on doing that.
Thanks very much for your expertise.
My pleasure, Alison.
NATO member countries are expected to contribute 2% of their GDP to defense spending, but most countries, including Canada, give less. Canada ranks 25th on the list, contributing 1% of GDP to NATO.
A key issue for NATO is Russia's annexation of Crimea. Ukraine is not a member of the alliance, but NATO has strongly condemned Russia's aggression and provided both political and practical support to try to help Ukraine better defend itself. We asked journalist Christian Borys, who is based in Kiev, for a perspective from Ukraine.
So when it comes to the question of what NATO is doing with Ukraine or could be doing, I think you have to take into account the fact that NATO already has partnership agreements with Ukraine. Their soldiers train together. They share information. I know specifically that analysts have told me NATO state militaries have found the war in Ukraine very beneficial to their own interests, because they're able to see Russian capabilities and their growth play out on an active battlefield. Especially when it comes to things like drone technology and how far that's grown since the war in 2008 in Georgia. When it comes to the question of whether Ukraine is going to be joining NATO anytime soon, it's totally impossible, because first of all, Ukraine is still at war with Russia in its east. Part of its territory is still annexed by Russia. Both of those things are not going to be solved anytime soon. We just saw a huge flare-up 2 weeks ago, which was the largest in 2 years. So this war is still very much very active. And also, Ukrainians aren't as united as people think they would be in support of NATO. A Gallup poll that just came out shows that the majority of Ukrainians don't support NATO, which a lot of people found very surprising, myself included, because we all thought that Ukrainians had really warmed to NATO. Previous polls had shown that, but this latest one showed that, yeah, in reality, a majority of Ukrainians don't support NATO, whereas in other Eastern European countries, the Baltics, Poland, the majority of people see NATO as a safety net, not as a threat at all. But here it's not the same way. And no matter how much support Ukraine gets from people like Canada's foreign minister, Ukraine just doesn't simply have a chance at joining NATO.
That's our program for this week. We'd like to hear from you, your perspective. Send us your thoughts, and also let us know about the issues that matter to you. You can reach us on Facebook and Twitter, or by email at perspective@cpac.ca. Next week, a feature interview with David Mulroney, former Canadian ambassador to China, about what Canadians need to know about relations with that economic giant. I hope you'll join me then. From all of us at CPAC, thanks for watching. I'm Alison Smith.